The scream that tore through the thin walls of the soddy house made Colt Edwards drop the bucket of water he'd been hauling from the creek. And for a moment he stood frozen in the gathering dusk, his heart hammering against his ribs like a wild horse trying to break free. He'd heard plenty of sounds in his 26 years on the frontier, from the war cries of raiding parties to the death rattle of men shot clean through. But there was something about a woman's cry of pain that cut straight to the bone and made every muscle in his body tense with the primal need to help. The year was 1878, and Georgetown, Colorado was a mining town perched high in the Rocky Mountains where men outnumbered women 10-1, where the silver veins ran deep and the winters ran cruel, and where a woman's scream in the night could mean any number of terrible things. He'd been staying in the old Miller place for 3 weeks now, ever since he'd ridden into town with nothing but his horse, his rifle, and the clothes on his back after a bad stint working cattle down in New Mexico territory. The soddy house next to his belonged to a young widow named Jane Easton, and though they'd barely exchanged more than polite greetings in passing, he'd noticed things about her the way a man notices the changing weather. She was heavily pregnant, her belly round and full beneath her faded calico dresses, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone carrying precious cargo. Her husband had died in a mining accident 6 months back, crushed in a cave-in that had taken 3 other men with him, and she'd been left alone to face the coming child with nothing but her pride and a stubbornness that Colt recognized because he saw it in himself every time he looked in a mirror. Another scream split the air, and this time Colt didn't hesitate. He crossed the 20 yards between their houses in long strides, his boots kicking up dust that caught the last rays of sunlight, and he pounded on her door with enough force to make the wooden frame shudder. "Madam, Mrs. Easton. You all right in there?" The silence that followed was somehow worse than the screaming, broken only by harsh, ragged breathing that sounded like someone trying to drag air through a throat full of broken glass. Then her voice came, thin and thready and edged with panic. "Please, I need help. The baby is coming." Colt's hand was already on the door handle, but he paused, knowing that propriety mattered even out here on the frontier, especially when it came to a woman in her condition. "I'm coming in, madam. Just hold on." The interior of the soddy was dim and close, lit only by a single kerosene lamp that cast dancing shadows on the earthen walls. Jane was on the narrow bed in the corner, her dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, her face pale as milk except for 2 bright spots of color high on her cheekbones. Her eyes, when they found his, were wide and frightened, the deep brown irises almost swallowed by her dilated pupils, and he could see her nightgown was soaked through with perspiration and other fluids he tried not to think about too hard. "The midwife," she gasped out between panting breaths. "Mrs. Callahan. She lives 2 streets over, the house with the blue door. Please, you have to get her." Colt nodded and turned to go, but another contraction hit her and she cried out, her hands gripping the quilt so hard her knuckles went white. He waited until it passed, counting the seconds in his head, and when her breathing eased slightly, he bolted out the door and ran through the darkening streets of Georgetown like the devil himself was on his heels. The blue door wasn't hard to find, and he hammered on it hard enough to wake the dead, calling out for Mrs. Callahan in a voice that probably carried halfway across town. The woman who answered was in her 50s, gray-haired and sour-faced, and she held a lamp up to peer at Colt with eyes that were hard as granite. "What do you want at this hour?" "It's Jane Easton, madam. The widow. Her baby is coming and she needs help right now." Something flickered across Mrs. Callahan's face, something ugly and mean that made Colt's jaw tighten. Jane Easton can manage on her own. I won't be helping her." Colt stared at the woman like she'd just spoken in tongues. "What the hell do you mean you won't help her? She's having a baby. She could die." "Mrs. Callahan's mouth pressed into a thin line. "That woman has been nothing but trouble since she came to this town. Her husband owed my son money she never paid back after he died. She looks down her nose at decent folk, thinks she's better than everyone else just because she can read and write. Let her face the consequences of her pride." The rage that flooded through Colt was hot and immediate, the kind of anger that made men do stupid things. But he forced it down and kept his voice level, even though what he really wanted to do was shake some Christian charity into this bitter old crow. "A baby's life is at stake. Whatever grievances you have with the mother, that child never did nothing to you. My answer is no. Now get off my porch before I call for the sheriff." The door slammed in his face hard enough to make the frame rattle, and for a moment Colt stood there in the darkness, his fists clenched at his sides, his mind racing through options that were all equally bad. He could try to find another woman who knew about birthing, but Georgetown was small, and if Mrs. Callahan was the midwife, then chances were good most women relied on her. He could ride for the doctor in Silver Plume, but that was 8 miles down the mountain, and by the time he got back it might be too late. Or he could go back to Jane and do what he could with his own 2 hands and pray to God it was enough. The decision made itself. He ran back through the streets, past the saloons where piano music spilled out into the night and miners drank away their wages, past the general store and the assay office, and all the trappings of civilization that didn't mean a damn thing when a woman was laboring alone in the dark. When he burst back through Jane's door, she was in the grip of another contraction, her back arched off the bed, and the sound she made was something no human should have to make. "Where is she?" Jane gasped when she could speak again. "Where's the midwife?" Colt crossed to the bed and knelt beside it so he could look her in the eye, needing her to see that he was telling the truth and that he wasn't going to abandon her. "She won't come. Something about your husband owing her son money, and her being too stubborn and mean to put that aside for the sake of a baby." The devastation that crossed Jane's face nearly broke him, but it was quickly replaced by something fiercer, something that reminded him of a cornered animal that knew it had to fight or die. "Then I'll do it myself. I've been reading, preparing. I thought I had more time, but I can manage." Another contraction hit before she could say anything more, and Colt watched helplessly as pain racked her body, as she bit down on her lip hard enough to draw blood. When it passed, she was weaker, her breathing more labored, and he knew with sudden cold certainty that she couldn't do this alone. He'd seen men die from wounds that should have been survivable because there was no one to help them, had watched the light fade from their eyes while he held their hands, and lied that everything would be all right, and he'd be damned if he let that happen to Jane Easton. "Tell me what to do," he said, his voice steady and sure even though his insides felt like water. "Walk me through it. I've birthed calves and foals, helped a mare through a difficult labor once. Can't be that different." Jane's eyes widened. "You can't. It isn't proper." "I couldn't ask you to do that." "You're not asking. I'm offering. And proper can go hang itself because there's only 2 choices here. Either I help you bring this baby into the world, or we both sit here and watch while something goes wrong that might have been prevented." He reached out and took her hand, and her fingers were cold and trembling in his. "I know we don't know each other, not really. I know this ain't how anyone would want things to go. But I'm here and I'm not leaving, and I swear to you on my mother's grave that I will do everything in my power to see you and this child through this night safely." Tears spilled down Jane's cheeks, but she nodded, squeezing his hand with surprising strength. "All right, all right." There's clean linens in the trunk at the foot of the bed. You'll need to wash your hands thoroughly with the soap and water in the basin. And there's a book, a medical book I borrowed from the doctor last month. It has a section on childbirth." Colt moved quickly, rolling up his sleeves and scrubbing his hands until they were red and raw, then pulling out the book and flipping through pages by lamplight until he found the relevant section. The illustrations made him swallow hard, but he read the instructions twice to commit them to memory, forcing his mind to work like it did when he was breaking a difficult horse, focused and calm and ready to react to whatever came. He spread clean linens beneath Jane, trying to preserve her modesty as much as possible while still being able to see what needed seeing, and he positioned the lamp so he'd have light to work by. "How far apart are the contractions?" he asked, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears, too level and practical for what they were about to do. "Close," Jane panted. "Maybe 2 or 3 minutes. They've been coming faster for the last hour." That matched what the book said about the final stage of labor, which meant the baby would be coming soon whether they were ready or not. Colt pulled up a chair and settled in beside the bed, one hand resting on Jane's arm in what he hoped was a comforting gesture, and together they waited for the next contraction to hit. When it came, she bore down with a groan that seemed to come from the depths of her soul, and Colt coached her through it the way the book said, counting out the seconds and telling her to breathe, breathe. "You're doing so good, just breathe." The hours that followed blurred together into an endless cycle of pain and effort and desperate hope. The night deepened outside the Sadi's small window, stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns while inside a different kind of creation was taking place. Colt lost track of how many times he wiped Jane's forehead with a cool cloth, how many times he helped her shift positions when her back spasmed with cramps, how many times he looked between her legs and saw nothing but blood and tissue, and the frightening evidence of just how dangerous birth really was. His own exhaustion was nothing compared to hers, but his shoulders ached from tension, and his throat was dry from talking her through each contraction, telling her she was strong, she was brave, she could do this. Somewhere around midnight he finally saw it, the crown of the baby's head appearing during a particularly hard push, and the surge of hope that went through him was almost painful in its intensity. "I can see the head. Jane, the baby's coming, you're almost there, just a few more pushes." She was crying now, tears streaming down her face, but there was determination in her eyes that he recognized from his own darkest moments, the refusal to give up even when every fiber of your being wanted to quit. "I can't," she sobbed. "I'm so tired. I can't do it anymore." "Yes, you can." Colt moved closer, supporting her shoulders as she bore down again, and his voice was fierce and urgent in her ear. "You're the strongest woman I've ever met, you hear me? You've been doing this for hours and you haven't quit yet, and you're not going to quit now. This baby needs you. Your husband would want you to fight for this child. So push, Jane. Push like your life depends on it, because it does. Push." She pushed with a scream that probably woke half the town. And suddenly, the baby's head was fully out, purple and wrinkled and slick with fluid. And Colt's hands were there to catch it, supporting the tiny skull with a gentleness he didn't know he possessed. The book had said to check for the cord around the neck, and thank God there wasn't one. And then Jane was pushing again, and the shoulders were coming through, first one and then the other. And then, in a sudden rush, the entire baby slid out into Colt's waiting hands. For a moment there was absolute silence, and in that moment, Colt's heart stopped beating because the baby wasn't crying, wasn't moving, wasn't doing any of the things a newborn was supposed to do. The tiny body was limp and blue, and panic clawed at his throat as he laid the infant on the clean linens he'd prepared. The book had mentioned this, had said what to do, and his hands moved on instinct, clearing the baby's mouth and nose with his finger, then rubbing the small back vigorously, stimulating breath, demanding life. "Is the baby all right?" Jane's voice was weak and terrified. "Why isn't it crying?" "Come on," Colt muttered, his hands working frantically. "Come on, little one. Breathe. Breathe for me." He turned the baby over and put his mouth over the tiny nose and mouth, breathing gently, carefully, praying he wasn't doing it too hard and would damage those fragile lungs. Once. Twice. 3 times. And then the baby gasped, a small hitching sound that was the most beautiful thing Colt had ever heard. And suddenly the infant was wailing, thin and reedy but unmistakably alive, and the color was flooding back into the small face, pink replacing the deathly blue. "It's a boy," Colt said, and his own voice was thick with emotion he didn't bother trying to hide. "You have a son, Jane, and he's perfect." He tied off the cord with clean string the way the book instructed, cut it with a knife he'd sterilized in the lamp flame, and then wrapped the baby in a soft blanket before placing him in Jane's arms. The look on her face was something he knew he'd remember for the rest of his life, wonder and love and exhaustion and joy all mixed together, and when she looked up at him her eyes were shining with tears. "You saved us," she whispered. "Both of us. I don't know how to thank you." Colt sat back in the chair, suddenly aware that his legs were shaking and his shirt was soaked with sweat and probably other fluids he didn't want to think about. "No thanks needed. I'm just glad you're both all right." But there was still work to be done. The afterbirth came 20 minutes later, and Colt disposed of it the way the book said. Checked to make sure Jane wasn't bleeding too heavily, helped her into a clean nightgown when she was steady enough to move. He changed the linens on the bed, boiled water to make tea, found some bread and cheese in her small pantry, and insisted she eat something to keep her strength up. The baby nursed for the first time, latching on with an instinct as old as humanity, and through it all Colt moved around the small soddy like he belonged there, like this was something he did every day instead of the most terrifying and miraculous experience of his life. Dawn was breaking by the time everything was settled, pink and gold lights spilling through the window to paint the earthen walls in warm colors. Jane was propped up in bed with pillows behind her back, the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms, and Colt was slumped in the chair beside her, exhaustion finally catching up with him now that the crisis had passed. "What will you name him?" he asked, his voice rough with tiredness. Jane looked down at her son, running one finger gently over the downy hair on his head. "Thomas, after my father, Thomas William Easton." She paused, then added quietly, "But I was thinking maybe his middle name could be Colt, if you wouldn't mind. Thomas Colt Easton. So he'll always carry a reminder of the man who brought him into this world." Something warm and unfamiliar bloomed in Colt's chest, something that felt dangerously close to belonging. "I'd be honored, madam." "Jane," she corrected softly. "After everything we've been through tonight, I think you've earned the right to call me Jane." He smiled, and it felt good on his face, natural in a way smiling hadn't felt for a long time. "Jane, then, and you should get some rest." "I'll stay here a while longer if that's all right, just to make sure you're both doing fine." She nodded, her eyelids already drooping with exhaustion, and within minutes both mother and child were asleep, their breathing synchronized in the peaceful rhythm of the well and truly spent. Colt watched them for a long time, this woman he barely knew and the baby he'd helped bring into the world, and felt something fundamental shift inside him, like a compass needle finally finding true north after years of spinning aimlessly. The next weeks unfolded with a strange new rhythm that neither of them had planned, but both seemed to accept as natural as sunrise. Colt found himself spending more and more time at Jane's side, helping with the heavy work that new mothers couldn't manage, splitting firewood and hauling water, and making trips to the general store for supplies. He'd taken a job at the livery stable, mucking out stalls and tending horses, work that wasn't glamorous but paid steady money, and kept him close by in case Jane needed anything. The town gossips had plenty to say about the arrangement, tongues wagging behind gloved hands whenever Colt walked down the street, but he found he didn't care much what they thought. Let them talk. He knew the truth of things, and the truth was that Jane needed help and he was able to give it, and there was nothing shameful in that. Jane herself was recovering well, the color returning to her cheeks and the strength coming back to her limbs as the days passed. Little Thomas was thriving, growing plumper and more alert with each passing day, and watching him discover the world with wide, wondering eyes never failed to make Colt smile. He'd never spent much time around babies before, had always figured that part of life wasn't for men like him, drifters and cowboys who moved with the seasons and called no place home. But there was something addictive about the weight of that small body in his arms when Jane needed a break, something profoundly satisfying about coaxing a burp out of the tiny stomach or soothing fussy cries by walking circles around the room. It was during one of those walking sessions, Thomas fussing against his shoulder while Jane tried to catch a few hours of sleep, that Colt found himself talking to the baby in a low voice, telling him stories about the places he'd been and the things he'd seen. "Your mama is something special, you know that. She's got more courage in her little finger than most men have in their whole bodies. The way she fought to bring you into this world, refusing to give up even when things looked bad, that's the kind of strength that can't be taught. You're lucky to have her. He's lucky to have you too." Colt turned to find Jane awake and watching him from the bed, her dark eyes soft in the lamplight. He felt heat rise in his cheeks, embarrassed to be caught talking to an infant like he was a full-grown person who could understand. "Sorry, didn't mean to wake you. He was fussing and I thought I'd give you some peace." "You didn't wake me. I've been lying here listening to you for the past 10 minutes. She sat up slowly, wincing slightly at the lingering soreness, and patted the space beside her on the bed. "Come sit." "We should talk." Those 3 words, "we should talk," had never meant anything good in Colt's experience, but he crossed the room and settled carefully on the edge of the bed, still holding Thomas against his chest. "If this is about the gossip in town, I can start spending less time here. Don't want to damage your reputation." Jane shook her head, a strand of dark hair falling across her face. "My reputation was damaged the moment I refused to play the proper grieving widow and bow my head to people like Mrs. Callahan. Let them talk. That's not what I wanted to discuss." She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for something difficult. "You've been here almost every day for 3 weeks now. You've helped me more than I had any right to ask or expect, but I need to know what you want from me, Colt. Because if you're looking for payment of some kind, or expecting certain favors because of what you did, I'd rather we settle that now before things get complicated." The implication in her words hit him like a fist to the gut, and for a moment he could only stare at her in shock. Then anger rose, hot and defensive, and he had to bite back the sharp retort that wanted to escape. She'd been hurt before, he reminded himself. Used and disappointed by a world that didn't treat women kindly, especially women alone. Of course she'd be wary. "I don't want anything from you," he said quietly, and he made sure she could see the truth in his eyes. "Nothing you're implying anyway. I help because I want to help. Because that night I delivered your son, something changed in me. I've spent the last 5 years drifting from one job to another, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots, telling myself I liked being free and unbeholden to anyone. but standing in this room with your baby in my hands, fighting to make him breathe, I realized that freedom is just another word for lonely. And I'm tired of being lonely, Jane. I'm tired of not mattering to anyone, of being able to disappear tomorrow and have no one notice I was gone. He looked down at Thomas, the baby's eyes closed in sleep, his tiny fist curled against Colt's chest. When I'm here with you and him, I feel like I matter, like the things I do make a difference. And if I'm being honest, somewhere along the way I stopped helping out of obligation and started helping because being here is the best part of my day. But if that makes you uncomfortable, if you want me to leave you alone, I will. Just say the word. The silence that followed stretched long enough to make his heart race, fear and hope tangled together in his chest. Then Jane reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on Thomas's back, her touch warm and certain. "I don't want you to leave," she said softly. "I look forward to seeing you every day. When you're not here, the Saudi feels emptier, like something essential is missing." I was married for 3 years to Thomas's father, and he was a good man in many ways, but we married because it was expected, because we were both alone in a hard place, and it made practical sense. I cared for him, grieved him when he died, but I never felt for him what I'm starting to feel for you. Colt's breath caught in his throat. "And what is it you're starting to feel?" She met his eyes steadily, no shame or hesitation in her face. "Like maybe God took away one thing but gave me something better in return. Like maybe all those people in town whispering about us aren't entirely wrong, even if their reasons are petty and mean. Like maybe I'm falling in love with you, Colt Edwards, and I don't know what to do about it." He should have said something smooth and romantic, something worthy of the moment, but all that came out was her name, rough and wondering. Jane. And then he was kissing her, careful of the baby still cradled between them, and her lips were soft and warm and tasted like the peppermint tea she'd been drinking. It was a gentle kiss, tentative and questioning, and when they pulled apart they were both smiling, a little shy and a lot hopeful. "So what do we do now?" Jane asked, and there was a lightness in her voice that hadn't been there before, like something heavy had been lifted from her shoulders. "Now," Colt said, settling more comfortably beside her on the bed, Thomas still sleeping peacefully against his chest, "I think we take things one day at a time. I keep coming around, you keep letting me. We get to know each other properly, not just in a crisis, but in all the regular, boring, wonderful moments that make up a life. And when enough time has passed that it's respectable, I court you properly. Take you to church socials and barn dances. Let the whole town see that my intentions are honorable." "And what are your intentions?" Jane's eyes sparkled with something that might have been mischief. "To marry you, if you'll have me. To be a father to Thomas and any other children we might have. To build a life here in Georgetown that matters, that means something. To wake up every morning next to you and fall asleep every night counting my blessings." He paused, suddenly uncertain. "If that's what you want too." "That's exactly what I want," Jane said, and leaned her head against his shoulder with a contented sigh. "Though I think we might be the talk of the town for a while." "Let them talk," Colt repeated, and he meant it more than he'd ever meant anything. "We'll give them something worth talking about." And they did. Over the following months, Georgetown watched as the widow Easton and the cowboy who delivered her baby fell deeper and deeper in love. Their courtship conducted partly in public and partly in the private moments that no one else saw. The quiet intimacy of shared mornings and evening conversations, and Thomas growing bigger and more responsive between them. Colt moved out of the old Miller place and into the boarding house on Main Street to preserve propriety, but he still spent most of his waking hours at Jane's Saudi, teaching her how to shoot so she could defend herself if need be, fixing the loose board in the floor and the draft in the window, playing with Thomas for hours while she cooked or mended or simply rested. He took her to the church social in August, and they danced together while the whole town watched. Jane in a new dress she'd sewn from fabric Colt had bought at the general store, her hair pinned up in a way that made her look both elegant and approachable. When old Mrs. Callahan glared at them from across the room, her face pinched with disapproval, Colt pulled Jane closer and waltzed her past the bitter woman with his head held high, silently daring anyone to say a word against the woman he loved. "You're causing a scandal," Jane murmured, but she was smiling. "Good," Colt said. "Maybe it'll give them something to think about besides their own petty grievances." September brought the first snow to the high country, dusting the peaks white and reminding everyone that winter was coming soon. Colt proposed on a Sunday afternoon when the aspen leaves were golden fire on the mountainsides, getting down on one knee in Jane's small front room with Thomas propped on the nearby chair, watching with wide, curious eyes. The ring was simple silver, all he could afford on a stable hand's wages, but Jane cried happy tears when she said yes, and the kiss they shared tasted like joy and promise and forever. They married in October in the small church on the hill, with half the town in attendance despite the gossips who'd predicted doom and scandal. Jane wore white even though she was a widow with a child, because Colt insisted she deserved it, and he didn't care what convention said. Thomas was passed around between well-wishers during the reception, already the darling of Georgetown with his bright eyes and ready smile. And when someone asked Colt if it bothered him that the boy wasn't his blood, he looked at them like they'd sprouted a second head. "That's my son," he said simply. "I brought him into this world and I'll raise him as mine. Blood's got nothing to do with it." They spent their wedding night in the soddy that would now be their home, though Colt had already made plans to build them something better come spring. A proper house with multiple rooms and glass windows, and everything Jane deserved. Thomas slept in his cradle in the corner, and Colt made love to his wife with reverence and tenderness, discovering the geography of her body in the lamplight, learning the sounds she made when he touched her just right, feeling like the luckiest man in Colorado when she whispered his name like a prayer. "I love you," Jane said afterward, curled against his side with her head on his chest, and her voice was drowsy and satisfied. "I never thought I could be this happy again." "Again?" Colt teased gently. "You mean you were this happy before?" She swatted his chest lightly. "You know what I mean." "After Thomas's father died, I thought my life was over in all the ways that mattered. That I'd raise my son alone, and that would be enough. That I didn't deserve or need anything more. But then you came along and reminded me that life doesn't end just because something hard happens. That there's always hope for new beginnings if you're brave enough to reach for them." Colt kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair, lavender soap and something uniquely Jane. "We'll build a good life together. I promise you that. Not easy, maybe, but good. Full of love and laughter and all the things that matter." "I know we will," Jane said. "I've never been more certain of anything." Winter came hard that year, snow piling high against the soddy's walls and temperatures dropping so low that water froze in the bucket overnight. But inside their small home it was warm, heated by the stove and by the love that grew stronger with each passing day. Colt worked at the livery through the worst of the weather, coming home each evening to the sight of Jane cooking supper and Thomas playing on a blanket on the floor. And he never failed to pause in the doorway for a moment, just taking it in, reminding himself that this was real, this was his, this was home. Thomas took his first steps in February, lurching across the room into Colt's waiting arms, and the pride Colt felt was as fierce and genuine as any blood father's would have been. "That's my boy," he said, swinging the toddler up into the air and making him giggle with delight. "You're going to be running before we know it, causing all kinds of trouble." "He takes after his father in that regard," Jane said dryly, but her eyes were soft as she watched them together. "Both his fathers, I suppose, the one who gave him life and the one who saved it." Spring brought warmer weather and the start of construction on their new house, a project that consumed Colt's evenings and weekends for months. Other men from town pitched in to help, the community coming together in the way frontier towns did when there was work to be done. And by summer's end, they had a sturdy two-room house with a real wooden floor and glass windows that let in light without letting in drafts. They moved in on a golden September afternoon, exactly 1 year after Colt had proposed, and Jane stood in the middle of the empty main room and spun in a slow circle, her arms outstretched. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "It's perfect." "You're perfect," Colt corrected, pulling her close. "The house is just wood and nails." "Romantic fool," Jane said fondly, but she kissed him like she agreed with the sentiment. That winter Jane discovered she was pregnant again, and though she tried to be calm about it, Colt could see the fear in her eyes when she told him, the memory of Thomas's difficult birth still fresh in her mind. What if it goes wrong again? She whispered one night when she couldn't sleep, her hand resting on the barely visible swell of her belly. "What if something happens and you're not there?" "Then we'll deal with it," Colt said firmly, covering her hand with his. "But this time you've got a midwife who will actually help, and a husband who knows what he's doing if things get difficult, and a whole town of people who have come to respect you, despite what they thought at first. You're not alone anymore, Jane. You'll never be alone again." She found a new midwife in Silver Plume, a kind woman named Mrs. Henderson who didn't care about old grudges or unpaid debts. And when labor started on a warm May evening in 1880, both Mrs. Henderson and Colt were there to help. This birth was easier than Thomas's, faster and less frightening, and when their daughter slid into the world squalling and pink, Colt cut the cord with steady hands and placed her on Jane's chest with tears in his eyes. "A girl," Jane said wonderingly, stroking the baby's damp dark hair. "We have a daughter." "What should we name her?" Colt asked, sitting beside them on the bed with his arm around Jane's shoulders. Jane looked up at him with a smile that lit up her whole face. "I was thinking Caroline Grace Edwards. What do you think?" "I think it's perfect," Colt said and kissed his wife softly. "Just like her mother." Thomas, now 2.5 and full of opinions, was less impressed with his new sister. "Baby loud," he declared, covering his ears when Caroline cried, and it took several weeks of patient explanation before he warmed up to the idea of being a big brother. But warm up he did, eventually insisting on helping with everything from diaper changes to feeding time, his small, serious face intent as he tried to copy what his parents did. The years that followed were full in all the ways that mattered, the kind of fullness that came from love and hard work and building something lasting. Colt eventually left the livery to start his own small ranch on land they purchased outside of town, running cattle and horses, and slowly building a herd that would support their family. Jane tended a garden that became famous in Georgetown for its vegetables and flowers, and she took in sewing work when she had time, her skill with a needle helping to supplement their income during lean seasons. They had 2 more children, another boy they named Christopher in 1882, and a girl named Julia in 1884, and their house rang with the sounds of childhood, laughter and arguments, and the constant background noise of a family that was happy despite the hardships. Thomas grew tall and serious, taking after his mother in temperament if not in looks, and he called Colt Pa without hesitation or doubt. Caroline was wild and fearless, always getting into mischief, and Christopher was the peacemaker, gentle-souled and kind. Julia was too young yet to show much personality, but she had her father's eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, and Colt predicted she'd be a force to be reckoned with when she grew up. There were hard times, of course, because no life on the frontier was easy. A harsh winter in 1883 killed half their herd and put them deep in debt. Christopher came down with scarlet fever and nearly died, leaving them haggard and desperate during the long week before the fever broke. Jane lost a pregnancy in 1886, and they grieved together for the child that would never be, holding each other in the darkness and finding comfort in the family they still had. But through it all they had each other, and that made all the difference. On their 10th anniversary, Colt took Jane up into the mountains for a weekend alone, the first time they'd been away from the children since Caroline was born, and they camped under the stars and talked for hours about everything and nothing. "You ever regret it?" Jane asked, lying beside him with her head pillowed on his shoulder. "Tying yourself to a widow with a baby, you could have had any number of women, started fresh with someone who didn't come with complications." Colt turned to face her, cupping her cheek in his hand so she had to look at him. "Listen to me, because I'm only going to say this once and I need you to hear it. That night, I delivered Thomas when I held him in my hands and willed him to breathe. When I looked at you lying there exhausted and brave and more beautiful than any woman had a right to be, something in me recognized something in you. Like our souls had been waiting to find each other and finally did. Every good thing in my life came from that moment. Our children, our home, the man I've become because you believed in me and loved me and made me want to be better. So no, I don't regret a single second. I'd live through that night 1,000 times if it meant ending up here with you." Jane was crying, but they were happy tears, and when she kissed him it tasted like salt and sweetness and the kind of love that transcends words. "I love you," she said. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes." Good scared or bad scared? Good scared. The kind that reminds me how lucky I am, how much I have to lose, but also how much I have worth fighting for. They made love under the stars that night, slowly and thoroughly, relearning the geography of each other's bodies and reaffirming the bonds that held them together. And when they rode back to Georgetown the next day, back to their children and their ranch and their ordinary, extraordinary life, they did so knowing that what they had was rare and precious, and worth every hardship they'd endured to find it. The years continued to pass, measured in birthdays and Christmases, and the slow accumulation of memories that make up a marriage. Thomas grew into a fine young man, responsible and hardworking, and when he was 18 he started courting a girl from Silver Plume, a sweet-natured blonde named Sarah who reminded Jane of herself at that age. Caroline turned out to be as wild as predicted, but also brilliant, with a mind for numbers that had Colt predicting she'd run the ranch one day. Christopher was gentle with animals and had a gift for breaking horses that rivaled his father's, and Julia was indeed a force of nature, stubborn and passionate and fiercely loyal to her family. In 1895, on a warm summer evening when the mountains were purple with shadow and the sky was painted in shades of gold and rose, Colt and Jane sat on the porch of their house and watched the sun set over the peaks. Thomas was married now with a baby of his own, making them grandparents at the young ages of 43 and 40 respectively. Caroline was away at school in Denver, studying to be a teacher. Christopher was working the ranch alongside Colt, and Julia was inside making supper, singing off-key as she chopped vegetables. "Hard to believe it's been 17 years, Jane said, her hand finding Colt's where it rested on the arm of his chair. "Since that night." "Best night of my life," Colt said, squeezing her fingers gently, despite how terrifying it was. "Mine too," Jane agreed, "though I might have said differently in the moment." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of evening settling over the land, crickets chirping and cattle lowing, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote calling to its pack. This was their kingdom, small and hard-won and more valuable than all the silver in Georgetown's mines, and they'd built it together from nothing but determination and love. "You think Thomas will be all right?" Jane asked after a while, because a mother's worry never really stopped even when her children were grown. "With the baby and everything, he'll be fine," Colt assured her. "He's got good instincts, and Sarah is strong like you, and if anything goes wrong, we're right here to help." "That's what family does." "You turned into quite the wise man," Jane teased gently. "Whatever happened to the cowboy who showed up on my doorstep not knowing the first thing about babies?" "He learned," Colt said simply. "He had a good teacher." Jane leaned her head on his shoulder, exactly as she'd done 1,000 times before, and Colt wrapped his arm around her and pulled her close. They weren't young anymore, both of them marked by time and hard work, gray threading through their hair and lines etched around their eyes. But when Colt looked at his wife, he still saw the woman he'd fallen in love with, brave and beautiful and his in all the ways that mattered. "I'd do it all again," he said quietly. "Every hard day, every setback, every moment of fear, all of it just to end up here with you." "So would I," Jane said, 1,000 times over. And as the sun finished setting and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they sat together in perfect contentment. Two people who'd found each other in the darkness and built a life in the light, who'd started as strangers thrown together by necessity and become the kind of partners who couldn't imagine existing without the other. The Wild West was changing, civilization creeping ever closer, but here in their small corner of Colorado, love still conquered all, and families still found ways to thrive despite the odds. Inside the house, Julia called that supper was ready, and with matching groans Colt and Jane levered themselves out of their chairs, their joints protesting in the way that middle age demanded. But they were smiling as they headed inside, hand in hand like teenagers, ready to gather around the table with the daughter who still lived at home and Christopher who'd stayed to help with the evening chores, ready to bow their heads and give thanks for food and family, and all the blessings they'd been given. Later that night, lying in bed with Jane curved against his side, her breathing soft and even in sleep, Colt stared up at the ceiling and counted his blessings the way he did most nights. 4 healthy children, a grandchild on the way, a ranch that was finally showing steady profit, and most importantly the woman beside him who'd given his life meaning and purpose. He thought about that night 17 years ago, about the way his hands had shaken when he'd first held Thomas, about the fear that had threatened to swallow him whole, and the determination that had pushed him through anyway. He'd been a cowboy back then, a drifter with no roots and no reason to stay in any one place. But delivering that baby had changed him in ways he was still discovering, had shown him what he was capable of when it mattered, had led him to the love of his life and a family he'd never imagined having. The midwife's refusal to help had seemed like a tragedy in the moment, but now Colt could see it for what it really was, the push that had been needed to set his life on its proper course. Everything had worked out exactly as it was supposed to, and he fell asleep with a smile on his face, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and looking forward to all the years still to come. Because that was the thing about love, real love, the kind that grew from shared struggle and mutual respect, and choosing each other every single day. It didn't make life easier necessarily, but it made life matter. It made waking up worthwhile and going to sleep peaceful, and it turned a simple house in the Colorado mountains into a home worth fighting for. And in the end, that was all anyone could ask for, all anyone needed. Love, family, purpose, and the knowledge that when your time came and you looked back on your life, you could say with absolute certainty that it had been worth living. Colt Edwards had found all of that and more, starting with one desperate night when a cowboy delivered a baby and discovered his destiny in the process. And he wouldn't have changed a single thing.